Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Maryland Podcast Awards. I'm your host, Brian Griffiths, the founder of Maryland Podcast Month and the host of the Duckpin Podcast. This month is the fourth annual Maryland Podcast Month, dedicated to promoting and celebrating all podcasts produced in Maryland. These first annual awards honor the great achievements of these podcasters over the course of the past year. This year, we are handing out awards in 9 separate categories, with an eligibility period spanning from April 1, 2020 through March 31, 2021. The nominees and votes all came from you, the Maryland Podcast listener. Thank you for your participation in these awards. Please take a moment to see all of the great things we are doing at Maryland Podcast Month. You can follow us on Twitter at Maryland Podcast, or like our page on Facebook at facebook.com/Maryland Podcast Month. Also, be sure to check out our full list of podcasts participating in Maryland Podcast Month on our website at marylandpodcastmonth.com. And if you would indulge me, please click subscribe on YouTube or on the podcatcher of your choice to subscribe to my show, the Duckpin Podcast. Without any further ado, let's get down to the Maryland Podcast Awards. Our first category is for the Best Produced Podcast. The finalists are The Conduit Street Podcast, The Drunkard United Football Show, Lawyers on the Rocks, My Arundel Biz Podcast, and The Loud Women's Club. And the winner for the Best Produced Podcast is Lawyers on the Rocks. Our next category is for the Best News Podcast. The finalists are The Conduit Street Podcast, Elevate Maryland, The Eye on Annapolis Daily News Brief, Lawyers on the Rocks, and The Loud Women's Club. And the winner for the Best News Podcast is The Eye on Annapolis Daily News Brief. Our next category is for the Best Sports Podcast. The finalists are The Drunkard United Football Show, Inside Maryland Sports Radio, On the Verge, Section 336, and the Young Terps Podcast. And the winner for the Best Sports Podcast is The Drunkard United Football Show. Our next category is for the Best Interview Podcast. And the finalists are Elevate Maryland, Harford County Living with Rich Bennett, Lawyers on the Rocks, My Arundel Biz Podcast, and the Duckpin Podcast. And the winner for Best Interview Podcast is Lawyers on the Rocks. That's their second win in this year's awards. Next, we have the Best Entertainment Podcast. And the finalists are The Drunkard United Football Show, JB's Drive-In Movie Podcast, Movie Schmovie, The Loud Women's Club, and The Middle Class Holes. And the winner for Best Entertainment Podcast is The Loud Women's Club. Next up is the award for Best Lifestyle Podcast. And the finalists are My Jewish Parents, The Loud Women's Club, The Middle Aging Podcast, The Middle Class Holes, and the Millennial Catholic Podcast, Conversations with a Priest. And the winner for Best Lifestyle Podcast is The Loud Women's Club, their second straight award win. Next up, we recognize the Best Host of the Year. And the nominees are Kevin Canale from the Conduit Street Podcast, Kurt Nachtman from Lawyers on the Rocks, Rich Bennett from Harford County Living, Sam Graham from the Drunkard United Football Show, and Sam Houston, also from the Drunkard United Football Show. And the winner for Best Host of the Year is Rich Bennett from Harford County Living. Our penultimate award is for the Best New Podcast. This award recognizes the best podcasts that launched during our period of eligibility, April 1, 2020 to March 31, 2021. And the finalists are Revenues, The Duckpin Podcast, The Loud Women's Club, The Middle Class Holes, and Wonks with Whiskey. Let us hope that all of these shows enjoy a better fate than winners of the Grammy for Best New Artists have. Especially my show. Anyway, the winner for Best New Podcast is The Loud Women's Club, scoring their third win of the night. And finally, we come to the biggest award, the Podcast of the Year Award, recognizing the best of the best from the past year. The finalists for Podcast of the Year are The Drunkard United Football Show, Harford County Living, Lawyers on the Rocks, My Arundel Biz Podcast, and The Loud Women's Club. And the winner for Podcast of the Year is Harford County Living. Congratulations to all of the winners, all of the finalists, all of the nominees, and all of us Marylanders who are creating new podcast content for you, the listener, to enjoy. Please tell your friends about your favorite Maryland-based podcast. It is through your support that we are able to grow our shows and attract new listeners. On behalf of all of our participants and all of our nominees, I'm Brian Griffiths. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a fan of podcast content created in Maryland. Thank you, and good night.